The cut list was already posted when Brigitte Bardot stood up from the third row and walked to the front. No one stopped her. She reached the board, pulled the pin, and took the document down. The list did not return to the wall. Minutes earlier, the cut list had been pinned to the standing board at the front of the room. Inspector General Maurice Herbelin stood beside it with the unhurried posture of a man who had arranged the room himself, his right hand resting near the board's lower edge, his body angled slightly toward the assembled guests, his eyes moving across the rows without settling on any particular face. The list was typed on official commission letterhead, the margins wide, the line spacing generous enough that every item on it was readable from the back of the room without effort. The room held 35 people arranged in rows of folding chairs, the screen still dark behind the standing board, the projector visible at the back. Journalists held notebooks open across their knees. Distributors sat with their programs folded in half, or set on the empty chairs beside them. The cut list named scenes, named sequences, assigned each one a classification code, and beside each code a single word indicating the nature of the restriction. Several people had already written those words into their notebooks before Herbelin had spoken a syllable. Bardot sat in the third row, her coat still on, her hands resting in her lap with the stillness of someone who has decided not to move before the right moment. The person to her left had already read the entire list and made 2 marks in their notebook. The board stood at the front of the room in the full light of the overhead fixtures, each line of the cut list legible from the front rows without leaning forward. Herbelin had not yet spoken to the room. He had exchanged a few words with an aide near the side wall when he arrived, adjusted the angle of the board once toward the center rows, and that was all. The list had occupied the room from the moment the doors opened, and everyone present had read it before sitting down, official, posted, public, permanent, in the way that posted things are permanent, and the coming remarks felt less like an announcement than a confirmation of something already decided. If you're interested in untold stories from cinema's golden age, subscribe now. This is a fictionalized dramatization inspired by real public figures and historical settings. It does not depict a documented event. By 1958, Brigitte Bardot's name appeared in more official documents than almost any other figure in French cinema, not in contracts, but in parliamentary transcripts, ecclesiastical circulars, and commission review files. Her films had generated formal complaints from institutions that rarely engage with cinema at all. Her name had appeared on commission review filings alongside those complaints in the same years it had appeared on marquees, and the commission had processed each filing according to its standard procedures. The Commission de Contrôle des Films Cinématographiques held statutory authority over exhibition, the right to require cuts as a condition of release, to restrict classification, to deny authorization entirely. Its decisions were not recommendations, they were conditions enforced through the licensing chain, connecting every film to every screen in France. A cut order meant the cut happened, and it happened before any audience saw the print. Herbelin had served the commission for more than a decade, his name appearing in studio production notes as a factor to plan around rather than appeal to after the fact. He had issued restrictions on films that later won major prizes. He had never reversed a posted cut order in a public setting. At no screening where he had appeared had he taken questions from the floor or reopened a concluded filing. The choice to post the cut list on a standing board in a press screening room rather than deliver it through standard administrative channels was a choice about audience. The press screening room had one. The cut order had been posted where journalists could copy it, and they had done so before the remarks began, their notebooks already open when Herbelin entered the room. That public form mattered in ways a private administrative decision did not. A cut order filed through official channels became a record inside an institutional process, navigable through the same bureaucratic mechanisms that produced it. A cut order posted in a press screening room became a quotation, a headline, a fixed point in the public record of a film. Herbelin had selected the venue, arranged the board, and invited the press. The cut list had been readable from every seat in the room before he opened his notes. Herbelin turned to face the assembled guests and drew a single sheet of notes from his breast pocket, unfolding it with a crisp motion that produced a brief paper sound in the quiet room. He described the commission's review process without consulting the notes directly, holding them open while his eyes remained on the room at a steady pace without pausing for questions or responses from the floor. He referred to the list on the board 3 times in the first 2 minutes using the phrase concluded determination, each time in a declarative construction without qualification. He gestured toward the board twice during his opening remarks, a controlled movement of his right hand, the fingers together, briefly, without holding the position. The list remained pinned through both gestures. Herbelin's voice did not rise or fall dramatically. It carried the flat, even authority of official address, not aggressive, not apologetic, level throughout, Several journalists in the center rows had begun writing in the first 30 seconds of Herbelin's remarks, their pens moving in short bursts of selective transcription. Two photographers near the side wall had shifted their positions, moving toward the aisle to improve their angle on the front of the room. The attention of the assembled guests moved in a loose pattern between Herbelin at the front, the list on the board behind him, and the third row, where Bardot sat with her coat on and her hands in her lap. Herbelin moved into the specific portion of his remarks, the section in which the list ceased to be a general reference and became a line-by-line account of commission findings. He read each item from his notes in the same measured cadence, assigning each a sequence number, a thematic designation, and a stated ground for restriction. The grounds were drawn from the Commission's established vocabulary: public decency, protection of minors, representation of public morality, applied to each scene without pause between items. He did not look at the board while he read. The board stood behind him as confirmation. The list held the room in the particular way a public document holds a room when everyone present knows that whatever is written on it will leave the building in their notebooks and appear in print by morning. Journalists were cross-referencing the board with their notes, their eyes moving up and back, verifying spellings, checking sequence numbers. One distributor near the end of the front row leaned forward in his chair and stayed there, elbows on knees, reading the list without looking up or writing anything down. Herbelin moved toward the projector setup along the right side of the room, still speaking, his notes now at his side. As he passed the standing board, he placed his free hand briefly against its upper corner, not gripping it, not adjusting it, just a moment of contact as he moved by, and then continued walking. The cut list did not shift. The pin held. The attention of the room had been redistributing for several minutes in ways now visible in the posture of the people seated in it. Heads that had been angled toward Herbelin were held differently, not turned away, but no longer exclusively directed at him. The photographers near the aisle had both moved again, both now oriented toward the third row. A journalist in the second row had stopped writing and was watching Bardot with his pen resting against the edge of his open notebook, its tip not touching the page. Herbelin had reached the concluding portion of his remarks and was moving through them with the deliberate pace of someone finishing rather than stopping. Two more journalists had stopped writing. The distributor in the front row had sat back in his chair and was no longer leaning forward. The board was still standing. The list was still pinned. The people nearest Bardot in the third row had shifted their bodies slightly outward, creating a gap between their seats and hers. Herbelin reached the final line of his remarks and delivered it with a slight pause, the kind that signals completion rather than invites response. He turned briefly toward the board, a gesture toward the document he had been referencing, then turned back to the room. He said the screening would proceed as scheduled. He said the matter was settled. He said it with his hands at his sides and his notes folded closed. The point of greatest concentration in the room had moved. Herbelin was still visible at the front, still the figure who had been speaking, but the room's active attention had migrated. Three photographers were now aimed at the third row. The journalist in the second row had not written anything for some time. Near the back, two people had leaned together briefly and then separated, their eyes moving to Bardot and then to the board. She had not yet moved. The board had not yet moved, but the room had already begun arranging itself around the possibility that one of those things was about to change. All eyes turned as Bardot rose from her seat in the third row. The motion was continuous and unhurried from the moment it began. No preparation, no gathering of her coat or her bag, no preliminary adjustment of her position in the chair. She simply stood, and then she was moving down the row toward the aisle, and then she was in the aisle, and then she was walking toward the front of the room along the right-hand side, her coat still on, her hands at her sides, her direction unambiguous from the first step. She reached the board and stopped directly in front of it, close enough that the list was within reach without extending her arm fully. She looked at the list for a brief moment, not reading it, but locating the pin at its upper edge. Then her right hand came up to the board, her fingers found the pin, and she drew it out with a single clean pull. The cut list came free from the board and into her hand. She brought it down, aligned its edges with a brief two-handed adjustment, folded it once along its horizontal center with a motion that was neither slow nor fast, but simply exact, and then turned from the board to face Herbelin. She held the folded list out toward him, her arm extended, and she waited with her eyes on his face and her hands steady until his fingers closed around the paper and the weight of it transferred from her hand to his. The room went quiet, at a depth that ordinary quiet does not reach. Herbelin was standing at the front of the room with the folded list in both hands and the empty board visible behind him. The pin Bardot had removed still resting on the small tray at the board's base. The document that had occupied the front of the room since before the doors opened, the fixed and public point around which the entire preceding event had organized itself, was now a folded rectangle of paper in Herbelin's hands, and the board behind him was a white empty surface under the overhead lights, with nothing attached to it. Several journalists in the center rows lowered their pens simultaneously, the pens coming to rest against open notebooks without writing anything. The distributor, who had been leaning forward, sat back completely, arms no longer on his knees, body fully supported by the chair back. A photographer near the aisle had lowered his camera from his eye and was holding it at chest height, the lens pointed at the floor. Herbelin looked at the folded list in his hands. His eyes moved across its folded surface, which revealed nothing. The text was inside the fold, invisible from the front. He looked at the empty board behind him. A brief turn of his head, then returned his gaze to the room. He looked at Bardot, who had taken one step back from the board and stood with her hands at her sides. His mouth opened slightly. The beginning of a word formed and did not complete itself, and his mouth closed again. A journalist in the second row raised his pen from his notebook and then set it back down without making contact with the page. Two people in the middle rows turned toward each other and then back to the front without exchanging anything audible. The photographer closest to the front wall raised his camera and then lowered it a second time, and it remained at his side. Herbelin shifted his grip on the folded list, moving it from both hands to his right hand, the paper held loosely with the fold facing away from him. His left hand moved to his side and then back up briefly and settled at waist height. He looked at the empty board. The pin was visible in the small tray at the board's base, a detail several people in the front rows were now looking at the pin in the tray, the folded document in Herbelin's right hand, and the empty board surface all visible from the front rows. The aide, who had been standing near the side wall throughout the proceedings, had taken a half step forward when Bardot stood and then stopped, and had not completed the step or returned to the wall. He remained in that intermediate position, holding a folder against his chest, his eyes moving between Herbelin and the board. The space through which Bardot had walked was empty. Nobody had moved into it. The room had the specific quality of a space in which everyone has stopped performing the activity they came to perform. The journalists who had been writing were not writing. The photographers who had been framing shots were not framing shots. The distributors were not calculating. Herbelin was not speaking. The board was empty. The list was in his hand. All eyes were on the front of the room. Nothing moved. No one moved on the floor of the projection room. The journalists sat with their pens touching their notebooks, but not writing. The photographers held their cameras without raising them. Herbelin stood at the front of the room with the folded cut list in his right hand, the board behind him white and unoccupied. 5 seconds passed. Herbelin looked at the board, a direct, sustained look rather than a glancing one, and then brought his eyes back to the room. His right hand adjusted its grip on the folded list slightly, and then was still. The journalists in the front row had not written anything, since before Bardot stood, their pens resting against notebooks, without producing marks. 10 seconds passed. A photographer near the aisle raised his camera slowly and held it at eye level, the lens aimed at Herbelin standing between the board and the room, the folded list visible in his right hand. He held the frame without releasing the shutter. Herbelin's lips parted slightly and pressed back together. The folded list remained in his hand, its text interior and invisible. 15 seconds passed. The aide near the side wall completed his half-step and reached Herbelin's position at the front of the room, speaking a single low sentence close to his ear. Herbelin responded with a slight movement of his head, not a nod, not a denial, but the motion of a man receiving information without producing a visible decision in response. The photographer released his shutter. The sound of the frame being taken was the first sound the room had produced in 15 seconds, and it was small, and it was very clear. Herbelin moved to the table beside the projector setup and placed the folded cut list on its surface, setting it down with the fold facing upward, the text still interior. He did not move toward the board. He did not reach for the pin in the tray. He addressed the room in the voice he had used throughout his remarks and said the screening would proceed. Then he moved to the side of the room. The aide followed him, and the projector operator at the back began preparing the equipment, and the overhead lights began their slow reduction towards screening level. The journalists in the room wrote more in the following 10 minutes than they had written during the entirety of Herbelin's address. Several were writing while the first frames of the film appeared on the screen, their pens moving across the pages in the near dark. The cut list sat folded on the table beside the projector, where Herbelin had placed it. It did not move during the screening. When the house lights returned at the end of the film, it was still there, folded, face up, its text invisible, the pin from the board sitting in the tray on the other side of the room. The board stood empty against the front wall for the duration of the screening and for some time afterward, while the room emptied and journalists collected their notebooks and distributors filed out in pairs toward the corridor. No one repinned the cut list. No one moved the board. When the last guests had gone, the pin was still in the tray, the list was still on the table beside the projector, and the board was still standing where Herbalin had positioned it before the room filled. Angled toward the center rows, the pin in the tray at its base, the surface bare. The cut list was on the table beside the projector on the other side of the room, folded, its text facing inward.